So let's talk about this women's rights movement during this time period. And the real right that they are working for is the right to vote. It's hard to believe at a time in U.S. history there was a long period of time when women could not vote. But this was that era, and it was going to change, especially under President Wilson. For women, they had been fighting a long time for the right to vote. African American men had gotten the right to vote before women. And there were groups like the National Women's Suffrage Association, which was led by Susan B. Anthony. She became one of the great and most famous women's rights leaders of that time period, suffrage leaders. There she is in her later years. But this was a time period where there were two different ways you were going to go about getting the right to vote. You could work on it on a national level, where you would try to get a constitutional amendment that guaranteed the women the right to vote, eventually the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. But probably the easier way might to work on it locally, to allow women to vote in local and state elections. And this era, if you allow women to vote in local and state elections, then you could hopefully convince enough people after they could vote locally that, hey, women are responsible and thoughtful. They should be able to vote in national elections too. Here's a cartoon of the period where it says on election day that this woman's going to go out to vote and leave her poor husband alone with his children. That's terrible. So there's two real, in this era, in the progressive era. Susan B. Anthony was before the progressive era. In the progressive era, you're talking about Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt. They are the two main leaders, and they have two real different ways of going about pushing this topic. They wanted more rights. They began to get involved in many, many more causes, and the women's rights movement grew to, at one point at President Wilson's inauguration, they had their own rally to support him, and 5,000 people showed up in Washington, D.C. from all over the country. In a time in 1913, this is a huge deal. But let's look at these two women for a second. We'll talk about them. Alice Paul was a militant organizer. She was the one who would go about and chain herself to City Hall or go on a hunger strike. This was militant stuff that would get in the newspapers and get everybody's attention. Alice Paul was kind of the face of the women's rights movement. Behind the scene was Carrie Chapman Catt. Her National Association of Women's Suffrage had a winning plan. It was behind the scenes. They were growing an organization that focused on a long 6-year campaign to get the right to vote. And when President Wilson became president, it kind of pushed it forward because he wanted women to have the right to vote. He just needed to convince enough people in Congress to pass a constitutional amendment that would be approved by 3/4 of the states. The main thing that happened during this era is World War I, where so many men went off to fight in the war, and what happened at home was that women began to work in factories, and women began to take many of the jobs that men had before they left, and they proved to the country that they were serious, that they could do the work of men. They did not complain when men came back from World War II and took those jobs back, but they proved to the country that they could be just as active a citizen as men could. And eventually, the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was passed in 1920, and that's kind of the end of the progressive era. The next thing we'll really talk about is World War I. But here you can see President Wilson signing the 19th Amendment, and here you can see some people partying because they're so happy the 19th Amendment was signed. And that's the end of the lecture.